3, 2, 1, and there you go. Right, sorry about the delay this morning, and it's wonderful to see you all. And today's lecture is the Fall of the Roman Empire, Part 1. And I think a good start with this lecture today is by describing that film, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, with Christopher Plummer. Now, if any of you have seen that film, it starts off with Christopher Plummer as the to-be Emperor Commodus, and he's visiting his father, Marcus Aurelius, who dies in 180. It's said that Marcus Aurelius was poisoned by his son Commodus, played by Christopher Plummer. And it's also said that Marcus Aurelius may have died of a plague. Now, that sets the scene. The wonderful thing about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, it might be a film from the 60s. However, it's a really good film because it starts off with the fall of the Roman Empire. It starts off with people in the film wanted to help tribal people from beyond the Germanic frontier. It talks about Marcus Aurelius finally defeating the people from the Germanic frontier, and all that sort of nicely painting my picture. So it's very helpful. And today we're going to actually go to a book that I've had for a few years. I just got to fiddle around with something a minute. Oh, we just got that sorted. Hang on. Just got a technical thing a minute, Rosamond. 1 sec.
Okay.
And that should be okay. Right, we start off with a book that's entitled The Emperors of Rome and Byzantium. You're not going to be able to see that, but if you're looking at my image, you can basically see. And this book itself, you can't get hold of it. It's it'll set you back between 250 and 300 quid. So don't even look for it. Well, I got hold of this book in 1988, and it's a wonderful publication. And I always use this for facts and figures because it tells me the name of the emperor, his name, when he was born, when he became emperor, when he died, how he died, length of reign, his family, an image of a coin he produced. Absolutely wonderful publication. The reason why I mentioned this is because we start off understanding the rise and fall of the Roman Empire and looking specifically at the fall of the Roman Empire. We need to start at the beginning. But before we start there, we've got to give you a word of warning. This is not a lecture that's as controversial as last week. But if you like the Romans, you're not going to like this lecture. So that's the word of warning. And the other word of warning, if you're sick to the back of the if you're sick to the back of your teeth in regards to the pandemic, you're not going to escape it in this lecture either, because this lecture looks at the fall of the Roman Empire and as one of the reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, may I add, because the fall of the Roman Empire ended in September 476, and the Eastern Roman Empire carried on for another 1,000 years, which is otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire. So we need to start off with Octavius, and we need to start off with Octavius's official name is Augustus. And we need to mention that the start of the Roman Empire was its ending. Strange statement to make. The image in front of you, which you're all seeing, are you seeing an image in front of you, Rosamond?
Yes.
Now, this is like one of those Hugo Boss images from the 1600s, and when we're thinking about a sort of backdrop like that, it's a calamity, it's a collapse, Dante's Inferno, the end of civilization, and for the Roman world, leading from the 200s, 300s, 400s, it was the end of civilization. And particularly the year is, lots of historians debate this, but the sensible date to start is 161 AD. And the plague that spread across the Roman Empire and the plague that spread from the East across the entire Eastern world was quite dramatic. You're talking about hundreds, not hundreds of thousands of people dying, but hundreds of millions of people dying of a period between 161 and 180 AD. So for the good part of nearly 20 years, the Earth is plunged into one of the worst outbreaks of anything that this planet has ever seen. And we look at the casualty figures today, and I don't want to say this to demean anyone that's passed, which is really tragic, but today's pandemic is nothing compared with this outbreak, this pandemic that occurred starting around 161 AD, and it's known as the Antonine Plague. And they don't really know or think it's anything like the Justinian Plague of 541, or the Black Death of 1349, that's a good start, or the outbreak in 1666, or those other outbreaks that we've seen since. We don't know if it's the same thing, it's unlikely. But it was very dramatic. A population like Rome saw a death rate over nearly 20 years of about 1 million people. So over a 20-year period, about 1 million people died in Rome itself. The population of Rome itself in 161 was 1 million people. But because the population of 1 million people, 100,000 people die, gets back to 1 million, another 100,000 people die, you can get an idea where the casualty figures are coming from. And it's said in Rome itself, after 161, every single year, every single week, it's said that at its height, 5,000 people were dying in Rome itself every single day. And this is the start of the end of the Roman Empire in the West. How the Eastern world survived is another debate. Now, whenever I mention the fall of the Roman Empire, I ask the question, how did the empire fall? How did it fall from the highest heights of civilization down to the lowest heights of deprivation when we look at Roman Britain? And the reason why we're doing this in two parts is that the second part covers the fall of the Roman Empire in Britain. So the first part sort of mentions that, but we go into the nitty-gritty. Lots of illustrations in regards to the fall of the Roman Empire. Lots of paintings coming from the 16, 17, 18, 1900s. This is when people want to talk about the fall of the Roman Empire. But the very interesting thing, it's actually first described by a Roman historian. And this Roman historian that describes it in the 160s, firstly, it's the first time a great outbreak like this is being described. And it's given the name the Antonine Plague. Rather interesting, because the wonderful emperor, Antonius Pius, dies in 161. And the reason why we're saying he's a wonderful emperor, Antonius Pius, if you haven't heard his name before, this is an emperor that nearly reigned 23 years, which was quite good going for a Roman emperor. He died of natural causes. And if anyone's ever heard of the Antonine Wall in Scotland, the Antonine Wall is named after Antonius Pius, but so is this horrible plague, which is a bit of a shame, really. A great Roman emperor, but he also gives his name to a great plague. So all these illustrations are very helpful. And this will upset Chris greatly. There's lots of facts and figures today, Chris. I know you don't like lots of facts and figures, but there's some very interesting things in those facts and figures. I'm going to be unfair if I asked a question of Rosamund at this point. Has she ever heard of the Seneca Collapse?
No.
Which was I wasn't actually asking you a question. I was making a statement. But the Seneca Collapse, no, exactly, no. You haven't heard of the Seneca Collapse. Basically, the Seneca Collapse illustrates society, right? And the Seneca Collapse is basically when society takes many years to build up, and then suddenly, within a week, within a year, within a couple of decades, the whole thing collapses. And the Seneca Collapse is what happened to the British Empire. 1947, within 30 years, the British Empire no longer exists. It's taken over 200 years for the British Empire to build up. and then suddenly it collapses within a couple of decades. That's called the Seneca Collapse. And also, the Roman Empire was also a Seneca Collapse. It took the good part of 1,000 years to build up, and then it took just over 200 years to collapse. Seneca Collapse. And it was a dramatic event. It was nothing really to do with tribes coming over from Germany. It's said that the Roman military, at the time of Antonius Pius, was about 25 Roman legions in strength, each with about 5,000 men. With the auxiliaries, it's going into the hundreds of thousands of well-trained Roman soldiers. By the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Roman army was down to about 5,000 men. You try and defend an empire with a large frontier with 5,000 men, you are not going to do it. It's not because of barbarians coming over from the Eastern world or from the northern frontier. It's due to many different factors. And in life, it's you know, we've all been in relationships, Rosamond, and it's a bit like a relationship. We always think that the end of a relationship was the other person's fault, and we always think that the end of a relationship is down to one factor. In fact, the end of a relationship is down to a number of different factors, and it's the same as the fall of the Roman Empire. Again, the Antonine plague illustrated there, the streets of Rome. But this is not just the streets of Rome. This is the streets of Roman Britain. The streets of Roman Britain, slowly but surely, you start to see an overall collapse. When you start to think about it, in the Roman world, you think about sanitation, peace, aqueducts, you know, the life of Brian, the whole list that goes on. But one by one, each of those aspects that makes Rome degrades and collapses. Okay, good point. Rosamond, when you mention Rome, what do you immediately think about? Just one thing.
Well, now you've said the life of Brian, I can just think of, well, what did the Romans give us? And they gave us quite a lot of things, didn't they? Roads.
Give us one of those.
Roads, one of them.
Oh
What
my
did the
God!
Romans give us?
I was
Roads.
actually looking for coins, but no, we'll do roads, right?
Oh.
No, that is brilliant. Roads is absolutely brilliant, right? The Antonine Way going into Rome itself, into the 400s, was full of potholes, right? And all the Roman roads in Britain by about AD 400 were unusable, completely unusable, because the Roman military was no longer maintaining them. That is really important. So what they start to use is waterways. It's a great myth that the Romans were proud of their roads, and the Romans used their roads more than anything else, right? The Romans actually started to use waterways more than anything. And in the archaeology, what we do see is an absolute rampant decay of roads across the Roman Empire, absolutely dire. And if they're in the Vale of Glamorgan, by St. Hilary about 10 years ago, there was a road that was slowly getting tighter and tighter. Mind my French, there was loads of crap on this road, and it was starting to collapse inwards, and you could barely drive a car down it. And now that road is closed, right? If you know the road I mean by St. Hilary, it's sort of off there on the right as you go down to St. Mary's Church, and it's closed, and because it's not maintained. It's a quick effect. The road is closed in a Seneca collapse, and without the systems of governance, without the systems of people, Rome goes into a mess. There's no one cause. This is rather interesting, and the clue is actually in the winged angel. This is again a portrayal of the Antonine plague, which believed ended in 180. But again, like many plagues, it keeps coming back. A word of warning from the past. A word of warning from the past is when civilization gets to its height, the only way it can go is downwards. It's a downward spiral. And the word, and that is actually called the limits to growth. So when civilization gets to a certain point, there's only one way it can go, is downwards. And today's society is on the limits of growth today. And before we were talking about these terrible things like the pandemic, we were talking about the environment. We were blaming the environment for our society's collapse. And now we're blaming the pandemic for society's collapse. Do you know what? There's no actual cause of the current collapse in modern day society. It's a load of different causes, but we don't learn from the archaeology. We don't learn from the past. One of the things it said that was actually the cause of the collapse of the Roman Empire was Christianity. You know, let's blame the Christians. Let's tar the buggers at the stake, right? And put them in the Colosseum and let's see them cry out to their God. And it said that the Christians were persecuted because they felt that they shouldn't have a big army. And when Christianity took over as the official religion in 337 AD under the reigns of Constantine the Great, it's then said it was the Christians' fault, right? That's very unlikely. But this portrayal shows an angel pointing to a doorway and somebody with what's left of a spear trying to smash the door open. And what they're doing is saying that this is vengeance from God. You dare kill my children, my Christians, and there will be a vengeance on Rome. And this is what this is portraying. But this is from the 1800s, this portrayal. Nothing of the sort. Christianity in the 160s was a cult. I will say it again, Christianity is a cult, and it was a cult back then. And it was one of the cults in the Roman world. There was nothing special about it. And it was not the downfall. It was not the cause of the Antonine plague, nothing like that, right? But this is a portrayal. Many people want to blame things in history, one or two events, but there's never one or two events that leads the downfall of society. There's a bucket load of events. It's a true bucket load. So what we're seeing the identity and the identification of this outbreak in the 160s. And again, the reason why I'm mentioning that is that up until the 160s, any outbreak of a disease wasn't recorded because it was commonplace. So say, for example, a Roman historian like Tacitus, a Roman historian like Cassius Dio might be writing about, events in the past. Tacitus writing about Julius Caesar 100 years before his time, Cassius Dio 150 years before his time, in 200 years AD might be writing about various things in the past. Historians were mainly interested in other things other than what was going on around them. But it was only in the 160s that people started to take notice of terrible events. And actually people were saying, these things are happening. They are real. And what is causing them? And they're starting to examine the causes of these outbreaks, which is rather important. They weren't going to the household gods and saying, here's a bit of gold, household god, save me from this. People had done this and they were still dying. They're rather important. And this is a very important thing that, people are really starting to take notice. They really are. And modern science is beginning now in the 160s. And one thing that I can remember from I haven't mentioned this for a very long time, so I'm going to share it with you. I used to say that when Roman civilization collapsed in the West in 476, all the skills to be civilized were lost. And actually, that is true. The advances in science that were made by the Romans, the advances in sanitation and the identification of disease did not come back in the level of scientific discovery and understanding until the late 1700s. So here we go. This is a really important point to be made. For 1,200, 1,300 years, people had lost the ability to identify the diseases that the Romans were identifying in the 160s. They had lost that science. They had lost the ability to treat things. And I think what has to be noted is that it takes a long time for society to recover from terrible calamities. It takes it a long time to rebuild. And I think you understand what I'm saying there. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is what we need to look at to understand where we go next today. And the Western Roman Empire, if we get my little annotation thing out here, there we go. And I can take a wonderful sip of the tea that Michelle's just brought me. The reason why she makes me a cup of tea when I'm lecturing and she's at home is so her name can be mentioned. That's why. It's a bit vain like that. So the Western Roman Empire consists of Spain. Note the date. Was conquered by 19 BC. So think about just before the birth of Christ. Gaul, France, had been completely pacified by 17 years BC. The Roman Empire managed to get to Britain by AD 43. We're also thinking about the whole of Italy had been conquered by 15 BC. Switzerland conquered by 15 BC. Are you noticing a pattern here? Austria, Slovenia by 15 BC. We're talking about Hungary, other parts of Austria, Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, Slovakia, Bosnia, and the likes of Herzegovina by the period of 10 AD. So that's really interesting stuff. And then what we need to do is we need to put a line through this list and say that that itself and a big chunk of Africa and in Egypt was later under the control of the Eastern Roman Empire. And at this juncture, we need to discuss something rather important. And we're forgetting that in the western part of the Roman Empire, you also need to add Mauritania, you need to add sort of Carthage and sort of the western side. That was part of the Western Roman Empire as well. And bits of Germany, the Netherlands, and obviously chuck in there Portugal. But the main interesting thing about these is that if you quickly analyze this, most of these conquests are made before the advent of Jesus Christ, and the others are added just after the birth of Jesus Christ and Africa. So within that period, around 1 BC and 1 AD, most of what we then see as the Western Roman Empire has been already conquered 160 years before the outbreak of the Antonine plague. Now that's really, really important. So in other words, you have this long growth from 753 BC, Aberbe Condita, Romulus and Remus, the foundation of the city of Rome and the wolf and all that gubbins, and that wonderful statue. And then it takes just around 800 years for Rome to build, and then it stagnates. Okay, you could talk about, Marcus Aurelius's conquests in the 170s, but that's only a little bit, okay? Most of the empire's intact. You could talk about Septimus Severus, who invaded northern Scotland by about 210, but, the most of the empire is mainly there by the birth of Christ. So there's a stagnation stage for 150 years. And then, because of all these terrible things happening, mark my words, the words are that in the period 300 years CE, or if anyone wants to use AD, so whenever you want to do the dating system, AD, Anno Domini, you put at the beginning of the date, and if you want to use CE, which is the common era, you use that afterwards. It's the same dating system, but except different letters. In 300 BC AD, after these diseases, after wars and all the rest of it, the Roman emperor One, if we go to my little book here we go. The Roman Emperor Domitian, no, actually Diocletian, here we go. Diocletian, in AD 300, says that the Roman Empire needs to divide in two. It needs to have a Western and Eastern world. And that is really, really important. And a Western and Eastern world, because Rome is unmanageable. You cannot manage Rome by itself. Very important there. You cannot have just this big empire. And believe me, it was a big empire. It included big areas of Asia. It was a very, very big empire. And the reason it was divided in two is to do with something rather interesting. And the reason why it was divided in two was because at the time of Julius Caesar, before Julius Caesar actually, 60 years BC, the Roman Senate would elect two officials from their ranks. And if one official got a bit nuts, the one official would go to the Senate and say, look, senators, we need to get rid of the other nutter, right? That's what we need to do. And Julius Caesar was an elected dictator, which is, you know, a bit of a contradiction, but he was an elected dictator. He had been one of those senators. And what would happen is every year there'd be an election and both senators would be removed and somebody else would become a senator, right? And the idea of dividing the Roman world is that if you've got one in the West and one in the East, the one in the West gets a bit corrupt. The one in the East invades, defeats the one in the West, and then he puts another one in, and that was the idea. That's the way it's meant to work, right? And strangely enough, the American system of having senators is based on the Roman system. And the reason why you have an elected president in America, and he can only be elected twice, is based on this old Roman system. But unfortunately, in America, you have presidents that last for 5 years, and I'm not going to get into the politics there. So again, moving on. You know, I absolutely love this technology. Being able to draw on the screen is great. Now we're on to something else. And actually, we're not going to do a great deal of who this guy is here. This individual is known as Alaric the Goth. Now, it has to be said, my next point. My next point is quite simple. You can only destroy an empire from within. Now, what do I mean by that? Alaric had been a friend of Rome. He had been an ally of Rome. He was head of the Goths. Basically, there was an agreement with the Rome about settlement and all the rest of it, you know, and they were friendly. Alaric would provide soldiers for the Roman army, friends. And then the Pope and the Roman Emperor, Honorius, mark my words, Honorius, he will come up. Honorius is said to have already moved the capital to a place known as Ravenna, and we will look at maps in a short while. And basically, Alaric said, you know, we need a bit of help, we need a bit of food and all the rest of it. We need a bit more land to settle on. And the Roman Emperor Honorius said no. And Alaric said, bugger you, I'm going to capture Rome. So Alaric turned against his own paymasters. Rome could only be destroyed by Rome in every single occasion, except Rome was conquered by the Gauls over 650 years earlier. But 650 years, Rome, the eternal city, had never ever been captured. Alaric captured Rome. And this illustration is absolutely, completely, again, bloody wrong. When anyone ever talks about the destruction of Rome in 410, all the buildings are not set alight. And that's a fact. When we look at the Pantheon, not the Parthenon, the Pantheon is this beautiful building in Rome itself, still stands today. You got the inscription Agrippa on the front. I think that's what is Agrippina or is Agrippa on the front of it. You can go to Rome itself. Beautiful portico, beautiful columns. You go in there. It's a domed roof. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a beautiful temple. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful sight. I saw an image of it the past few days. Wonderful sight. If all of Rome was set alight, that building would have gone down in flames for one. You know, the Capitoline Hill on this illustration on fire there, it was not set on fire. Lots of buildings in Rome were not destroyed. When you think about Popey there, Popey was not in Rome at the time, so this illustration is completely wrong. Also, if we want to spot the mistakes of the fall of Rome, if we don't have Muslims at that point either. They come about 250 years later. Alaric would not have had people of dark skin in his army, for example. So there's so much wrong about the interpretation of the fall of Rome. And the key issue is the fall of Rome. The fall of Rome was not in 410 AD. It did not happen like that. It did not happen in that way. Because what happened is Alaric took over Rome, and basically the senators were still there. Lots of people were still there. Most people weren't enslaved. You had to feed 1 million people, right? And do you know what Alaric said? Bugger this for a game of soldiers. And Rome was abandoned to the Romans because nobody could manage it. Because there was too many people. You can't slaughter 1 million people. Do you know what I mean? You can't do it. You've got to feed them. And it's all right. And that's it, really. But it was captured by Rome. It was taken over by Rome. That's a really important point. Rome did not fall in 410 AD. It did not fall that day. Did not happen that way. And that's a really important point, right? If you get any book, Rosamond, it will say that the Romans left Britain in 410 AD. An absolute lie. That is an absolute fantasy. The Romans
was that the beginning of the end, though? 410 AD.
No, the beginning of the end is the Antonine plague. That's the point.
Okay.
But 410, yeah, okay. Okay, if we want to restate that, 410 is the end of the beginning of the end, basically.
Okay.
If we want to get poetic there. The beginning of the end is the Antonine plague. That's really clear. This is what I want to put across. And this date 410, we analyze this in a few weeks' time. If you look at any book, it always said the Romans left Britain in 410. They didn't. Keith has been with me to Bird Oswald, and when we went to Bird Oswald, and you didn't go to Bird Oswald with us on Hadrian's Wall, Rosamond, but when we went to Bird Oswald, it clearly said that there's a Roman garrison still at Bird Oswald in 430. So the Romans leaving Britain in 410? They didn't. And it's based on one single writing that Honorius, the Roman emperors, asked for assistance from the Britons. And he says, now you've got to look to your own defenses. But some people actually believe that he actually has a plea from the Britons, which is a place in Italy, not Britain, the island. So again, more about that again. And the spellings, we will talk about that in the future. So, whilst I take a slurp, Rosamond, the mic is yours. Tell me what you think so far.
Yes, well, that's interesting about the end of the beginning of the end. And I think that picture sort of maybe just trying to portray, rather than that being true events, perhaps with the Pope being there, what's his name? Alaric, the Goth on his horse. Yeah. Alaric. Yes. What is in one picture? It's trying to say perhaps what was going on and how it happened. And what was the point of the Pope? What did the Pope? Where was his part in the fall? The part of the fall of the Pope was basically to say to Alaric, you know, don't sack my Rome, you know, don't take over Rome, and that's basically the role. But again, more of that again when we come back to it. But I think the word you were missing then is this is a metaphor for the end of the beginning of the end. I think this is a complete metaphor for that period of about another 60 years, which was really dramatic. Christianity
people capturing Rome. Rome is captured another 2 or 3 occasions after this. Rome is no longer the capital of the Roman Empire in the West. Slowly but surely, things are contracting. Thanks for that contribution, actually. Very sensible.
Well, I was also looking at this. Go
back again.
The lady there. Was she being taken away, and that was her husband? And was it showing that you see the woman there being taken away by the Muslim and the man? Is it showing that the households were falling?
I think you've gone beyond. Yeah, that's exactly. This is a metaphor.
Have I gone off?
Yeah. No, that's correct. It's even though Islam isn't coming in there. There's another level. There's another tier to this. Obviously, people's households are starting to collapse. What somebody said to me on Tuesday, they said, right, I asked them, what do you think about the fall of Rome? What do you say? And he said it was to do with Germanic tribes coming over the border, over the lines, the defense that's been set up by Hadrian and the emperors earlier on, and they're slowly invading the Roman world. But that's not exactly true. What's true is that lots of them are being invited over to settle, and they're being used for mercenaries against the Hunnic people that are building up towards the eastern frontiers, particularly on the Germanic frontier, not the ones on the Iran frontier down in the southeast. And the other thing as well is that he said, oh, it's also to do with the fact that people in Rome were too rich and that they were keeping all the wealth themselves. But that's not exactly true. They're losing their wealth. And in other words, the rape of a city, the rape of civilization is when people's wealth, their pockets, their ability to spend starts to decay. And this is what this is showing. So you've nailed everything there. That's good. Let's go on to the next image now.
Yes, thank you.
And I love maps. Don't you? Do you know what? You can get lost in a map. You can get completely lost.
I love a map.
I love them. A good old map, isn't it? Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And basically, to sort of give you an idea where we're going, I've mentioned Rome. So our wonderful Rome is there's our Rome. I'm using yellow. That's probably not the right color. And there's our Ravenna. Okay. And basically the capital city's moved. And this is going on in the 400s. So in other words, Rome is no longer the great eternal city. And in fact, much of Rome's wealth is already moving. And where is Rome's wealth moving? What happens is quite interesting. Is Rome's wealth is actually moving completely somewhere in another direction. It's going all the way over to here. This is obviously an earlier map. This is the Roman Empire around the birth of Christ, a little bit beyond. All of Rome's wealth by the 400s is going to Byzantium, because what's happening, the Caesars or the leaders of the Eastern world are basically saying, look, we want all the stuff over to Byzantium. This is going to be now the new empire. And that's very, very interesting. You mentioned Muslims earlier on, and I mentioned Muslims earlier on. And that's really key. It's a massive thing, that. Because in the year 1453, Mehmed the Great captured Constantinople. And when he had captured Constantinople, it's said that Mehmed had returned home. He's a Muslim. He's come from the East, and he's come home. And when he got to the great cathedral, the Hagia Sophia, the great sort of cathedral in Constantinople, one of the greatest Christian cathedrals on the planet, he said this cathedral is going to be now the new home of the new Roman Empire. Because Mehmed II felt that by conquering the Eastern Roman Empire and then conquering the Western Roman Empire, he was going to unify the two worlds and reclaim the Roman world as it had been. And that may sound absolute crazy what Mehmed wanted to do, he wanted to replace the Christian religion with the Muslim religion by conquering the Eastern and the Western Roman world to create the new Roman Empire. And you will hear this from some of the historians and archaeologists. And it was that idea that the Roman Empire was once great. And mark my words, the Islamic world in the 1400s was a world of illumination. It was the world of trade. It was the world of finances. It was the world of great bazaars. It was the world of a great religion. Islam itself was an enlightened religion. Islam itself respected the Greek Orthodox Christianity. When Mehmed captured Constantinople, he was appalled that one of the Christian shrines had been torn down and destroyed. And Mehmed said, no, we're not going to destroy the Greek Orthodox religion. We're not going to destroy it. It's not going to be destroyed. We're going to respect it. Even though we want to replace Christianity, we're going to respect it. The only way to win over the Christians is by making them friends. The old Roman idea of Pax Romana, you can enslave them, but they've got to be within your world. You've got to treat them with some level of respect. And you know, Mehmed II absolutely hated Roman Catholicism because he believed, like some of the people, that it was Roman Catholicism that was the death knell of the Western Roman world. You can see there's lots of very interesting things in this information. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to get back to my cursor and get the screen back to where it was. And again, you'll see some rather interesting things now. And the rather interesting things, if you follow my arrow, the yellow areas are the Roman Empire as it had been at the advent of Augustus, Octavian. And if you look at this map, around 31 BC, because Octavian Augustus reigned over 40 years, the yellow areas were the areas that were handed down to him by the likes of Julius Caesar and the other Republican conquests. And then, in the reign of Augustus, the central part of Turkey was added to his empire, and all of this is the age of Cleopatra, the defeat of Cleopatra, and then the rest of Spain was added. This area was also added, and little bits of northern Africa. So not towards the end of his reign, but most of what you do see with the Roman Empire 150, 200 years later has already been conquered. So the stagnation sets in. And then towards the end of his reign, these areas are added. And then we look at Varus, where this area is added and then it's not added. So, and then it only takes later on for other bits to be added, and then you have the Roman Empire. So then, more or less, you have a long period of stagnation. When an empire stagnates, eventually it will collapse in a Seneca collapse. And what are we seeing in America today? And what have we seen with our empire in Britain? All these things repeat. History repeats itself. A Seneca collapse is always going to be there. The only way to avert the Seneca collapse is to understand one civilization on the planet that did really well. The people of the Amazon jungle. The people of the Amazon jungle survived for tens of thousands of years, populations of millions of people, because what they did, they took a piece of land, they cultivated it, they built houses there, and when everything was brilliant, a Garden of Eden, they would abandon it and go somewhere else, avoiding a Seneca collapse. So in other words, and if you want to look for metaphors and ways of looking at things in life, if people reinvent themselves, they refresh themselves. and then they can be renewed. And that's not just a parable. That's a very useful parable. If Rome had actually embraced the new way of thinking and started to think, right, what we're going to do now, we're not going to conquer countries anymore, right? Which is where they were at. If they started to think in about 100 years AD, right, we're not going to conquer countries anymore, we're going to trade with them. We're going to actually start to Romanize them from outside. We're going to actually start to take on their ideas, take on their ways, a bit like the Islamic world did. There you go. The Islamic world. And the reason why the Islamic world started to become stagnant by about the end of the 1600s, the 1700s, is because they stopped inventing themselves. When civilization, because what we did with the British Empire, what we did, we basically said, oh, look how wonderful we are. We're so great. And that was our end. You know, when Gandhi said in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, let's do something different. The British said, no, we're not going to do anything different. And then we lost India in 1947. We don't learn from history. History is a very powerful learning curve. And do you know what? This is great. And I tell you what, when this goes out as a recording, right? Screen snap this plan, right? Because you could do a whole lecture on this sort of chart, this wonderful plan in front of you. Is great. And why this is great is it shows all the information that I need, except in regards to the Antonine plague. So if we want to sort of add a few things to this chart, what we need to do, we need to write at the bottom there, 1/1 CE, right? Capital letters CE. We need to put that there, right? There it is. And then what we then have is we have 100. And can you see what's happening on the chart? This is the height of Roman civilization, 100 years AD. And then strangely enough, something starts to happen about here. And what's happening here is the Antonine plague. And then in the 200s, things slowly start to renew, and look at this collapse. Other than this line, things start to collapse in a major way. This is the Seneca Collapse. This here is the buildup of Rome, and then the collapse of Rome. You can obviously see the stats are bearing out in the archaeology. It's a really interesting sign of how things are going. Let's find that yellow there. And let's explain this chart. I really love this chart. So all the way from the start, they're thinking about coins, right? And there's a massively high silver content in their coins, a huge silver content in their coins, to around roughly 100. And then there's a collapse in the silver content in their coins. And you can see it's a start, and look at that there, a massive drop in the silver content in their coins all the way to here. And there's 2 points to be made. The first point is that when Rome, there we go, there it is. When Rome had got to its highest point, around 100 years AD, going into the reign of Hadrian, when we're extending it a little bit, Hadrian's Wall, and in Germany, and on the eastern frontier. What's happening is that suddenly there are less people mining, right? They're trading less externally, so less silver's being placed into the system, meaning that there's less silver into the coins, leading to a collapse in the economy. And then suddenly, look at that there. That is such a massive collapse. It's a huge collapse. And I tell you what, right? And whatever you do, Rosamond, don't say anything. I'm on a roll. 200 years here. When we look at this period here, any coins from this period are absolute rubbish. There are iron-based coins with a coating of silver on it. Really poor coins. Really, really poor. And you get the likes of Posthumus and Tetricus and Domitianus. And you get all those people in the 200s, right? And earlier before that, you know, the silver content in coins is basically collapsing. It's a massive issue here, huge issue. Some Roman emperors, like Diocletian, revalues the money, puts silver back into it. But by his point, there's very little silver in the coins. And you know what, right? Now you can interrupt, Rosamond. Wouldn't it be wonderful for you to be down in Truro to find 52,000 Roman coins? Wouldn't that be great?
Would I have to announce them to the heritage? I suppose I would.
Yes, you would. It's 52,000 coins, but there's one problem with that coin hoard, right? Lots of those coins date from this period, right? Which means that there's little silver content in them.
Oh.
And do you know how much value those 52,000 coins? Those 52,000 coins is probably worth £52,000, right? But if that had been 52,000 coins from this period, you would be a millionaire. In Britain, in the 200s, we start to find coin hoards. And there's in Sully, right? There's coin hoards, again, from this period after the 200s, right? One guy found, I think it was a coin hoard of about 6,000 coins. Another one found another coin hoard of about that level. And he declared it and he thought, I'm a millionaire. And the archaeologist said, we love these coins, right? That they're probably worth about £1 or £2 each. And this is really, really important, right? And if anyone's ever had a copy of my book, The Romans in the Vale of Glamorgan, and for the first time, if anyone wants a copy of my book, let me know. I can send them a copy. Let me know afterwards. In the back of my book has got a really interesting inventory. And in the back of the book, strangely enough, less and less coins in the Vale of Glamorgan are found after the 300s, right? And very, very few from this period. Very few from about 400. And in the back of my book, it does mention the Roman Emperor Honorius, 410, Arcadius, and it doesn't mention any emperors after that period. I think we've got coins from, I think, Constantine the Third, which are also mentioned in my book, which date from about 407. All right, so I use them in my book. But after that, after about 410, 4 whatever, there are no coins with Roman emperors' names found in the Vale of Glamorgan or Cardiff or anywhere like that, Bridget. Right? And archaeologists have taken that as evidence to say that that was the point that Roman civilization collapsed in the Vale of Glamorgan, which is untrue, because very few coins are coming over to Britain at that point. Soldiers are being paid in a different way. The fort at Cardiff is still operational, 410, 412, 413, that type of period. It's still operational. Those walls that you can see at Cardiff Castle today, under the footprint of the walls, are actually the Roman wall that dates from the 400s. But they're being paid in a different way, right? Maybe it's being told, right, you can have a bit of land and you can settle here, right, but you're still going to defend the fort. That's the coin evidence. And then what we then do, erase all that. And then what we then find is that we find something else going on. So the coins tell us about the collapse of the Roman Empire. Also, this is really interesting, marine archaeology. We very rarely do marine archaeology in these classes, but I will be doing marine archaeology as a subtopic in the near future. So what we've got here, the marine level tells us that up to the birth of Christ, what we do see on Roman wrecks is rich amphoras, you know, full of oils, sargram, and so on and so on. We find wonderful things. And then what we then see is that after about, I get a bit sick of this when people come and go in the class, right? it messes things up for me. Right, okay, so then what we then get is that then with the wrecks, there are less and less richly bestowed wrecks being found. And that sort of shows that there's less and less wealth in the Roman world. So back to that other point I mentioned about wealth, there's less and less wealth. It's being taken out. There's less and less wealth being produced. And then the other final thing on the chart, a couple of other things is that we'll link this in up to, again, about 100. There's lots of cash flow, and then suddenly there's less and less cash flow. So you can't really pay the soldiers anymore, which is really, really important. So that's really, really important. And then what you then see is this is massive. The Roman armies are building. Coming up to about here, you've got Emperor Hadrian, 25 Roman legions, each Roman legion with 5,000 soldiers plus another. Each legion's got an auxiliary attached to them that says another 5,000. So you do the maths. Very large Roman armies. And then the Roman army, there we go, sort of Antonius Pius. Then you go up to Septimus Severus. There's still money being paid to these soldiers, but it's really devalued. And then they're paying mercenaries. And then the Roman army starts to collapse about, coming to about 300. And then again, a little bit of a thing. And then suddenly, look at this, a Seneca collapse. The Roman armies collapse. There isn't enough soldiers to defend the Roman Empire. And look at that. And then by 476, there's about 5,000 Roman soldiers in the Roman army. From a height of about 150 to 200,000 soldiers, 5,000 is an absolute collapse. And then the final thing to actually look at this is the final thing to actually look in the archaeology. As an archaeologist personally excavating, do you know what? In my archaeological career, I've only ever found 3 Roman coins. But those 2 of those coins told me a lot about the landscape. So one Roman coin that I excavated associated with archaeological artifacts dated to this guy here, Trajan. And then I find another coin dating to this period. And the quality of this coin, I'm on the right compared with this one, it's a completely different world. And then talking about the artifacts, which this is basically talking about, you can see that in the archaeology we get lots of artifacts. We get lots of artifacts being found. 100. That's the Roman Samian ware. The Roman Samian factories are set alight around here, so lots less goods going into this country. And then we have a rise in goods and trade in the Roman Empire. So things are recovered after the Antonine plague, but things are deteriorating. They deteriorate again. Lots more trade, and then bang, collapse, an absolute collapse in the economy into the 300s, 400s, and then when you get to this period, you get very little archaeological artifacts from the Roman period being found on archaeological sites in the later period, simply because the potters, there are less potters, there's less trade, and things are completely going up the creek. So what we're going to do now, I'm sure that some of us need a break. So what we're going to do, Rosamond, is before I open the mics, have you got anything to say about anything that I've said so far?
Well, it's fascinating, really, how history does repeat itself, isn't it? Listening to what's happened there in the Roman ages and sort of likening it to today, and how the American system is based on the old Roman system. I didn't know that. The American Senate based on the old Roman. So yes, looking through that.
And can I just stop you a minute? Can I just stop you a minute, right? If you look at the American system, in America there's only 2 political parties, right? There's the Republicans and the Democrats. There's 1 or 2 Greens, there's 1 or 2 Independents, but there's Republicans and the Democrats, right? At the head of the Republicans and the Democrats, there's a House leader, right? And those House leaders, if you've heard in the press over the years, those leaders almost run America, right? It's not the president that runs America. It's the head of the Republican Party and the head of the Democrats in the Senate, right? And you've heard this. and it's in fact, you know, when we look at when we look at the likes of Barack Obama, he can't get bills through the Senate, and George Bush can't get bills through the Senate, and Donald Trump can't get bills through the Senate. The realization is that he's not running the country. It's the Republicans and the Democrats and the head of those parties running the country. That is 100% the Roman system. And the reason why it doesn't work is because it failed in the past, and they're still using that system today.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So if you haven't got anything else to say, we're going to bring everybody into it. Again, this is being recorded, so if you don't want to see your faces shown, you need to cut your camera now. So on 3, 2, 1, all back. What I'm going to do is unmute you all, and joined by Jane. So who is first? Right, Goff, would you like to say anything first? Has to be quick, my friend. Hang on. If not, right, you've got to unmute yourself. Everyone's got to unmute themselves. This is why I've given you. You've got to unmute yourself on the screen, all of you.
Carl,
yeah, go for it.
I've got ticking or a metallic ticking on all through your thing today. Has anybody else got that?
No, mine's clear.
No. Okay.
Okay, Carl. No, it was pretty good, very interesting. A lot of things I didn't realise about the plague. But bottom line about all these things, it's all about money, isn't it?
It's always all about money, and do you know what? I don't want to be the doom and gloom of everything, right? But what I would like to say is that it's not doom and gloom. If you actually learn from the past, right? If we learn from the present situation, if we learn from things in the past, we can improve ourselves, you know. It's not doom and gloom at all. But we've got to start. It's not just about money either. It's about having new values. And I think the statement I made about the American Senate, that's a really important statement to make. Chris, anything?
No, Carl, that was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Ellen?
Only a little bit. You know, you were saying about the Amazon tribes and that they succeeded in living. It's probably that they lived a more natural life with nature and moved on before they'd actually destroyed or used up all their resources.
That's what's going on. Can I just jump in on that, right? The sense of civilization and the sense of a natural lifestyle isn't by any way detrimental. I know you weren't saying that.
No, but can I link up quite a few things?
Go on quickly. Go.
North American Indians do the same, but they move on seasonally and don't use all the plants and animals and resources there.
Correct.
Civilizations that remain in a spot have to then expand and expand and expand, becoming more concentrated in the middle and overrunning further and further afield. And then because they've run out of natural resources, they have to rely on modern human man-made things like plastics and things.
Yeah.
Also, things like when you said less potters, less people finding metal, natural resources, they're in abundance when they're found. Then over the decades and centuries, as the resources are used and ravaged, they become less findable.
Yes.
And so the use of them, like for coins, then becomes less prevalent.
Right. I've got to jump in there. 2 points there. The 2 points there. Lead itself is obviously the plastic of the age. And the other key thing is outside Rome, that there's I think I'm told there's 100-meter high mound of amphora, and the Romans are not recycling. If the Romans had recycled that amphora, now this is a massive point, right? This is huge. If the Romans had recycled all that amphora, they would have had more clay. They would have had all that clay, you know. And the Romans didn't recycle. They recycled glass later on, but they didn't recycle. So that's a key point. And quickly, Ellen, because there's other people want to say things. Go on.
No, that was it. Because humans do tend to use absolutely everything, and then move out to use everything more.
Humankind.
They don't live with an environment.
Exactly.
And the boundaries of that environment.
Exactly. Humankind is a bit of a cancer, like we saw with Pablo Benito. Right, Karen, anything quick?
No, nothing to add. Very interesting.
Keithy, babes?
No, I'm okay. I just need a coffee.
Jane, anything quick?
No, it's very interesting.
Right, and for the others, Sue, Jim, Andrea, Pam, anything you want to say quickly?
Did they realise that what was causing their disease, or?
Yeah, there's a physician that we will mention after the break, and we'll go on to him after the break. So, and Pam, quickly.
No, nothing.
And
nothing
Jim.
at all.
No.
I was going to say, when silver was less in coins, did that mean that the value of silver went up?
When silver was the value of silver went up in another way because it was traded outside the world. So what they would do, they would outside the Roman world. So the silver went out, and inside the Roman world basically it's a debased coinage. So what would happen is a Roman soldier would be given all these crappy coins that they're finding in coin hoards in England, and they would basically bury them because they can't carry 52,000 coins. It's like you guys going out to a shop and going in with a tenner, right? Having £9 worth of change in pennies. I'm sure one or two of you might think, "Oh my God, I'm just going to walk out without this because it's too much to carry." So this is what's going on. And Sue, quick, anything?
Yeah, Marcus Aurelius. I mean, he's a voice that is very contemporary and modern. For those of you who read his meditations, you know, he sounds like a very contemporary man.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to take a break now, and we will be back.
Thank you.
We've got to do Seneca. I can't. These pens are just wrong. That the latest book that Archaeology Company is publishing, I've just got a proof in front of me. It's about the Frolic paddle steamer that sunk on March the 17th, 1881. So Well, I'll keep you updated on when that's going to be available. Has anyone ever come across this book, The Ghost of Harry Smalls? I was sent it in the post, and it's about some kind of a knight who fell perilously into the sea at Dunraven. So I'll review that and put it in the newsletter. So obviously I've mentioned about this coin, and interestingly enough, Rosamund's going to get very excited because the new GoPro cameras arrived with all the equipment. And another box here as well. All the stuff has arrived, except we do have the one problem, because there's lots of plebs out and about at this minute at places. So we're going to have to get an overcast day when there's going to be less people out to do some recordings. And finally, those of you might be able to tap into us live, because we will have the technology to do live walks in the next few weeks. So with me and Rosamund out and about, right, you can tag into looking at archaeological sites live.
That'd be good.
Ooh. So there you go.
2 meters
That
apart.
sounds good.
What's that, Goff?
You'll be 2 meters apart.
Yes.
Well, I've got to be 2 meters apart from Rosamund anyway, because her husband Tom gets very jealous.
To film you if you're any closer anyway, wouldn't it, Carl?
What's that, lovely?
It'd be a bit difficult for her to film you if she's any closer anyway.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that is really true. That good point. I know Goff is a stickler for detail. So next week we're going to be looking at. Do you know what? I knew what we were going to be looking at next. Next week we're going to be looking at the archaeology of the Greenland Vikings.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
So I'll actually be contacting you all on Monday, and obviously those that are joining us.
Red.
What's that?
Eric the Red.
But I know he's related
Eric the
to.
Red.
I know he's related to you, and obviously we've got Saturday as usual, and yes, and as you were talking about your sofa, Jim, we're going to start making nice wattle fencing out of willow and hazel. So anyone interested in any of that, let me know. So what we're going to do, we're going to get started now. I think Rosamund's contribution earlier on was very useful. And who haven't I picked on to join me in these lectures? Who's nice and quiet and timid? Definitely not Ellen.
Oh, Carl, before you, is there when you ever likely to do a trip up to London to do Romans in London? To see their amphitheatre and things that are there?
Oh, do you know what? I'd like to go to the Bloomsbury building and actually see the Mithras Temple.
That's very good. I saw that last year.
I think the point is with things like that, tomorrow we've got this meeting, and obviously we're going to discuss about trips like that. But the postponed trip that we're going to be doing in September, the excursion, there's obviously the certain stipulations that we've got to go with. So we'll be discussing that tomorrow. Anyone else got anything to say before I carry on? And lovely Jane, because I haven't spent much time with Jane. Jane's gonna, I'm gonna borrow Jane for about 40 minutes. So there you go. Right, so here we go. Everybody's mics off, except for Jane's. And it's gonna be me and Jane in a moment, you know. It's just like, which one are you, Jane? Oh, right, here you go. Right, Jane, you might need to unmute yourself so I can speak with you.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, Jane. You know what? That is a stentorial voice.
Oh, good.
It's a stentorial voice with a lot of bent behind it. You know, it's just it's the type of thing we need.
Oh, wow, that's all right.
So,
okay.
Right, so here we go. So let's just do a little bit of a roundup of things and something that I haven't already done. So what are you seeing on your screen? What are you seeing?
Yeah, we can see that graph again. That
right. No, that's what I need. So just a few other things. That's okay. Right. Okay. Just a few other things. Right. So the main thing, obviously, the talk about the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And, you know, I'd like to go through a little bit of a list. You know, people used to say that the fall of the Roman Empire was about not enforcing your governance over such a vast territory. And obviously, you know, it's to do with cause and effect. If Diocletian had actually really, truly realized what the problems were in the Roman Empire, he wouldn't needed to have divided the Roman Empire in two in the year 300. The population is obviously growing, and when you've got a growing population, you have to change the way you do things. And if you keep the population growing and growing and growing and growing, what you do find is that you do get to a point where you've got the limits of growth. I mentioned that the second time I mentioned the word limits of growth. The limits of growth is very much what happened at the time of the plague. You know, in 1349, in 1300, the population of Britain was growing to a massive 7 million people. So by the time I got to 1349, with constant famines, with things like anthrax, with now the plague, it was the point for the Seneca Collapse. And within 2 years, the British population had reduced from 7, some say, to 2 or 3 million. So that's an absolute collapse in British population. Seneca Collapse, you get to the level of the limits to growth, and that's it. You can't go beyond that. And when you get to the limits of growth, that's 7 million in medieval Britain, or the hundreds of millions of people across the Roman Empire, if they had to realize, right, now we need to do something, and not, because what we do in lots of situations in modern day life, say for example, again, the relationship situation, you know, you're in a relationship, it's on its ends, and instead of giving the lady some flowers, or making the gentleman a meal, you should have actually sat down and actually chatted what the problems were. So this is what we're talking about Diocletian. He should have seen what the real problems were. The other thing is said that histography, that's a word that we've come across twice in lectures, histography, it's said that climate had a role to play in the collapse of the Roman world. Again, like we've seen today, we're seeing climate and disease, interesting. And the one thing about the Goths are coming over to the Roman Empire in 376. They're invited over, and they're fleeing from the Huns, who are creating a big empire. And there's lots of civil wars internally, the collapse of an empire. It's all, if you want to look for metaphors, if you look at armies in history, if generals disagree with the way the fighting should happen, that's going to cause how the army collapses. You know, it's internal fighting. Very similar to what could be said with Waterloo. If the French generals had actually listened to Napoleon, maybe they would have won it. You know, with all those different metaphors. And in the year 476, the Western Roman Empire was negligible. The Roman Empire would have collapsed anyway. It was going to happen, right? It was negligible. Politically, financially, it had very few domains. And what happened, the final general, a Roman trained general, even though he was on Roman bread, Ogdeka, he basically captured the city, and the senators said, right, here's the standard, right? And Rome ceased to exist. So I've mentioned about this plague quite a few times. There are lots of different dates for the plague. You can look the plague up as starting in 161. In my book here, I still use books. My book that is called Plague, Pox and Pestilence. Wonderful book. Loads of dead bodies in it. The date given in here is 161. On the internet, it's 165 for the start of the Antonine plague. Doesn't matter. It's still known as the Antonine plague. It's also known as the plague of Galen, because Galen was the first physician to recognize that it was a plague. He said, actually, there's something not quite right about this new plague. Galen was a Greek physician. and he traveled across the Roman world, and he first said that one of the causes for the outbreak of this new pandemic was actually the Roman army itself. Because what they were doing, they were going into the Eastern Empire, fighting peoples beyond the Eastern Empire. And this plague infected the Roman legions, and is apparently there was 1 or 2 legions which were completely wiped out, because in close proximation of people, it went through, it is nothing to do with cleanliness now, it's to do with the fact that you got close proximations of soldiers. And he described a few, this wasn't described before by any historians about any outbreaks before. Galen described that the plague was of a long duration. It was a great plague. He mentioned fevers, diarrhea. He mentioned skin eruptions. He mentions these skin eruptions the skin can be really dry, causing to pustules. This can be an illness that lasts 9 days. And he also, he didn't clearly define this as being of a specific, he didn't give it a name. This is why it was known as the disease of Galen's. And in all sorts of, people actually thought with the eruptions of the skin, it sounded a little bit like smallpox. And it lasted, it went to its height after 9 days. Lots of these things, great plagues, seem to sort of, if you survive the Orestes pestis, which is the bacterium which is associated with the Great Plague of the year 541 and of the year 1349, that's the Orestes pestis. And to be honest with you, back then, because this is just freshly being identified, like with the coronavirus, people didn't know what it was. It took months for people to identify what it was. Galen's didn't eventually, we knew it was a great outbreak. So what I'd like to do is we will mention a little bit about the Seneca effect, though I want to move on with the images. So Jane, let's move on with the images. And in other words, if you compare the earlier maps with you know, a later map of how the Roman world is looking, this is not much different from the map of Augustus. Again, that stagnation of an empire. Empires stagnate. Even the Spanish Empire, after the destruction of the English Armada, after about 2 or 3 decades, the Spanish Empire becomes stagnant after a great period of success. Again, looking at this map and then going down the middle, these are the 2 empires. Now, you could say to me, look, Carl, right, I'm listening to you, I'm agreeing with some of it or not agreeing, right? Surely the Antonine plague hit the eastern side of the Roman world. It did hit the eastern side of the Roman world. But for some strange reason, the eastern side of the empire bounced back. So when Diocletian's dividing the empire into 2, it's almost as if the Eastern Empire has reinvented itself where the Western hasn't. And it's almost as if the East are looking towards the East for trade. And the Christian religion is different in the East. And they've got more resources in the East as well. They've got more access to the silks from India, for example. They've got more access to precious metals, where in the West, things start to stagnate. If you ask me what the West should have done, I think the West should have looked outwards as the East did. I think the West should have embraced the Germanic people sooner. I think the West should have traded with the Germanic people and saw them as equal. And the East did something very, very different. What happened with Roman Catholicism? Roman Catholicism, my French, got very anal. It was full of itself, right? It got so special. It thought it was indestructible. And with that, things got tighter and more constricted in the West. Okay. Okay, here's a clear division. And this is rather interesting. And this is rather interesting because by the time you get to the 450s, By the time you get to the 450s, there's a few things happening, and there's one or two things I disagree with this plan, but I didn't do it. So what's happening is all these areas here are no longer part of the Western world. So they've lost half of their landmass. But in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire was the same it was 100 years earlier. It had not contracted one bit. So that's one difference. And the other thing of some interest to us with the next lecture that we're going to do on the fall of the Roman world, particularly in regards to Britain, is that you can see that there's no purple covering the area of Britain. There's no Western coloration in Britain. Now, I categorically disagree with this, and some other archaeologists would agree with me, that people in Britain still said we are Roman, right? We are still part of this great empire. That's very similar to me saying I'm British. I'm still part of this great empire. Because when you think about the sense of Britishness is a sense of unification. I'm dreaming because we're not unified. We don't have an empire anymore. But back then, we know that the people of Britain still looked towards Rome. They still felt themselves Roman. So in essence, most of that blue arrow there, when you think about Britain, is still part of the Roman world. They still see themselves as British. They've still got little garrisons here and there. But strangely enough, folks, within the blink of an eye, within 20 years, most of the Western Empire is whipped away. It's collapsed. But most of the Eastern, well, all of the Eastern Empire is still there. So in other words, I think what lots of you should do is go away with all the information. And I think the answer to the collapse of the Roman world is very much in what I've said about the Eastern world. And the Eastern Roman Empire is our answer to today's problems. That may sound very brash, but I look towards the past for answers. Do you know what? Like, I've had lots of relationships in my life, and I've always, for the first major relationships, I ignored the mistakes of the ones I made before. So this one now, I've got to agree with everything that Michelle says and tells me to do, and things are nice. And that's the best way to be, isn't it, Jane?
Absolutely, yeah.
Agree with what the other person says, and you can't go too far wrong, even though she's wrong most of the time. Anyway, so if you're got a bit of an internet thing a second, I'll let that ride. Okay, right. So by the time you start to get to the 470s, this is quite stark. By the time you get to the 470s, that's gone. I don't even know that whoever put this together is that shouldn't really be there. So all that's really left is, in fact, bingo. So the original Italy is all that Italy's left, and that itself is basically the end. And within a few years, most of that, probably all of that has gone, and that's gone to the east, and big chunks of that's gone. That's gone. So that's all that's left of the Roman world, really. It is completely gone. Anyway, moving on a little bit further. Do you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to explain a little bit more about this Seneca collapse, because it's got so many meanings. It's got so much understanding, and rather interestingly, it's saying that the Great Plague began in 162 on this one. A plague killed 1/3 of the Roman Empire. Now, some of my facts and figures alter, but the facts and figures I actually go with is that the population of the Roman Empire was at least 100 million plus. Okay, that's the population of the Roman Empire. I've seen estimates of it being as large as 200 million. And it's said possibly that the world population is maybe beyond 500 million. Okay, so the one thing that can be said by that is that this plague didn't just affect the Roman Empire. It affected the known world, except for Central America. So if you think about, for example, over a 20-year period until the last serious bit of the plague abandoned the world by about 108 years AD. If you think about the plague maybe having a responsibility for the death of 100 million people on the planet over a period of 20 years, I tell you what, that is astronomical. That 150 million people. That's not as great as the Great Plague in the year 1359, but it's quite amazing. Okay, and you can probably get an idea why this has such amazing effect on the Roman Empire. So another little bit of a plan here. So what I'm going to do, you can look at this and I will go to my notes. The Seneca effect, in effect, is this. The Seneca effect or Seneca cliff or Seneca collapse is a mathematical model. And this mathematical model is based on the letters to Lucilius in around the year 91 to 63 BC. And these are letters by Lucius Seneca. And these letters basically talk about the limits to growth. This guy was the Nostradamus of the day. He could model the collapse of the Roman world. He saw that there were limits to growth. He was 2,000 years before his time. And what he saw was, as we see today, there suddenly becomes a shortage of fossil fuels. That's what we see today. He also saw that the levels of pollution and all these different things which have been learned from this. And again, he quotes the following again: the limits to growth, and this is called the Seneca Collapse. You get to a point and society is on another transect. I think this is a rather interesting plan, and the rather interesting chart, more than a plan, and a rather interesting chart. And why this is an interesting chart is that this is pre-plague, okay? And pre-plague tells us that pre-plague there was a large market in wine. And then the market post-plague starts to collapse. And here we go. Another thing as well is about land. Land prices go sky high. And then look at it. Land prices start to collapse, or by almost a half when you look at cheap land. Does this look like a modern model? Prices for rent recorded by various different transcripts seem to be very high pre-plague and seem to drop after the plague. And look at that, almost by half. Oil is less in production after the plague. And strange things, wheat are about the same. And look at monthly wages. Monthly wages rise. And there's two reasons why wages rise. The first reason is that plague has had a negative effect on human populations, meaning that people are in higher demand, but also the monthly wage does go up, but the value of the coinage drops. So in other words, you might be paid 2 denarii, but the value of the silver in the coins are so depleted that the coins themselves don't really have much value. And this is a rather interesting one. Donkeys. Now, donkeys could be seen as really good for technology, but it's likely that figure with more and more donkeys out there might be saying that innovations, technology isn't as great as it was before. the plague hit. Again, all these indicators with the slow decline of human civilization. I think we got some text coming up. There we go. The Antonine plague. Just to sort of highlight the beginning and the end, the end of the beginning and the end. Roman troops returning from battles in the Middle East brought back spoils of war, smallpox, possibly. It decimated the population of Rome and is thought to be the single greatest cause of the weakening of the Roman Empire in Northern and Eastern Europe. But we know that Eastern Europe recovered. That's really key. Again, key what I said a while ago. If you think about how the Eastern Roman Empire survived, that'll give you the answer. And the other thing about believing history and not believing the archaeology, it wasn't Marcus Aurelius who actually died of plague, but some believe he may have, which is quite appropriate because he died in 180 at the end of the plague outbreak. But it's said that his heir apparent, and lots of things about this. So here we go, like getting all the way down my chart, okay. The heir apparent is Lucius Versus. Now, Lucius Versus was basically the adopted son of Marcus Aurelius, and Lucius Versus, it's said, died of natural causes in 169, 11 years before Marcus Aurelius, and it's said that Lucius Versus may have died of the Antonine plague, which again is rather interesting. That we've got senior members of society dying. So if an emperor's dying, then that tells us a lot. So one thing that I want to link in with actually next week is this, Greenland, and it's when we look at the archaeology of Greenland, when we look at the Greenland Vikings next week. The Greenland ice cores not only tell us about the collapse of Viking civilization in Greenland, the cores tell us of lead in the atmosphere, and that's rather important. Lead detected in the atmosphere up until the 100s. There's a large indicator of lead in the ice cores in Greenland. And then it said by about the 200s, there's a collapse in the lead manufacturing industry. And with that being said, a collapse in the lead manufacturing industry, the lead in manufacturing, the lead in the evidence of lead extraction also help us understand what's going on. Why is it so difficult to understand something that was so massive as the fall of the Western Empire? But by looking at the quantitative information, the mechanisms that we've already looked at today give us astonishing results to really understand this direction. Again, this chart that we've already looked at in a nice bit of detail before the break. And you can't blame. Actually, you've got to say that the barbarians protected the Roman emperors in the later stages of the collapse of Roman civilization, because it was those that were actually used as mercenaries. Again, more money would go out of the Roman world to pay these mercenaries. But I think when we actually look at this, I think the biggest thing to be said is that the massive collapse is here. And obviously, when we look at the plague, this is the great start of it. And again, the Roman army, and then that's a huge collapse. That's a Seneca collapse within the Roman army is absolutely annihilated within 60 years. 60 years for the collapse of a big army, and that's what's happening. It's said that the Roman army collapsed into being bands of soldiers, bands of brothers out there fighting, rather than actually legionary units. So let's go back to my mouse and move on a little bit further. So the beauty of this data helps us understand where we're going. And when the Roman economy ceased to function, as shown by the data on lead production, lead production throughout history is a good indicator of how society is going. Did we not look at the archaeological evidence at St. Bees a few months ago? Wonderful lecture. And if I may say so myself, and at St. Bees, we saw that they were able to identify the St. Bees body as being from the 1300s, from the lead, because there was a high lead production in the medieval period again. And this again is what we're seeing with the sense of the Seneca collapse, a huge buildup. And this is a bit, again, like a tide. So when you get a buildup of a tide, a tsunami wave, and then it crashes down. So that's what we're nicely talking about. Again, moving on. And I know your eyes are going to bleed looking at this chart, so we'll just be really quick. But it's a really good chart. I like it. Nice one. So let me get my little figures, my little colours out, and I think that'd be good. So what we got in the to do with the detections of lead in the ice cores, what we can clearly see is that throughout the Iron Age, the production of lead, as shown in the ice cores, is rising, and no idea what that one is. But then again, it's slowly building. It's slowly building, and it's going down again for whatever reason. And then look at this. It's a massive level of lead production in the Western Hemisphere. And if anyone asks why, again, we got connection a minute. If anyone asks why we don't have a lead age, I'm not exactly sure, because you've got an Iron Age, Bronze Age, and all the rest of it. But if we're talking about a lead age, maybe the lead age is sometime in the Iron Age when production levels are starting to increase massively. And then what we've got is the point that we're interestingly looking at is somewhere here. That's the Antonine plague. Lead production absolutely plummets down this red line, all the way down. No, actually, I've made a mistake. I got too excited. I meant, hang on, start again. Hang on, my fault. I meant the other curve. Hang on, there we go. So start that bit again. So basically, sorry for that mistake. I meant to go with the other one. So that's increasing all the way to the birth of Christ. And for whatever reason, there's a little detour, and then leading all the way up. This is what I meant to say. All the way leading, all the way up to the period of the Antonine plague. Lead production skyrockets. There's a massive level of lead production, because this is when the Antonine plague hits. Again, apologies for that mistake. And then massively, absolutely on a massive scale, lead production plummets. Look at that. And that's what we see in the ice cores. That yellow line, it drops bottom level. Lead production collapses. And when we think about the Roman world, we look at lead piping. Lead piping's needed for the baths. Lead piping needed for sanitation. Lead is needed for the military. And if we get to it, and I know time's getting on, but hopefully I can do about another 10-15 minutes. What happens is that people are no longer down the mines. And what happens is the mines flood. And then when mines flood, you can't unpump them. Technology does revive a little bit. And this is rather interesting. Technology does revive. This is the period when we got villas being built in Britain. And then on a huge level, the wealth of the Roman world again collapses, and there we go. And the production of lead in the Western Hemisphere goes back to levels that are pre-Roman. So if we take that line there, almost to the Iron Age levels is production of lead in the Western Hemisphere. And the point to be made there quite clearly, the huge point to be made is then, when we do this bit again, there's an absolute collapse in civilization in the Western Hemisphere, a huge collapse. Again, I've already mentioned it. Civilization almost goes back to pre-Iron Age levels after Roman civilization collapsed in the West, but it survives in the East. Here we go. This Perpetual Camel's the straw on a camel's back, for example. It's not noticed by the emperors. Diocletian, he doesn't notice that civilization's collapsing around him. He doesn't see it. It's a bit like politics today. People didn't see it, but now politicians have become irrelevant. They were relevant a decade ago, and now they're no longer relevant. You might be nodding your head and disagreeing, but we used to have respect for politicians, right? But now we don't. People didn't see that happening, right? And what's happening with the Roman Empire is that it's not the case that the barbarians invaded and weakened the empire. It was weakening itself from within. And the collapse, the most likely culprit. So in other words, we're getting slowly to the end. Debasing the Roman denarii is debasing and destroying the economy. All of us look on our banknotes today. It no longer says that the Bank of England will honour this banknote to the value of sterling, or earlier on the level of gold. It's actually, it will value the banknote to another banknote. So in other words, the value of systems are collapsing. So with less silver in circulation, nobody wants to buy anything. Sounds familiar? Nobody is selling anything. Sounds familiar? And if nobody is selling and nobody is producing, the collapse of the production of precious metals may very well be the element we are looking for. Alongside the plague is the collapse in the economy. So interesting thing here, I'm going to read this out as it is. Of course, the debasing of denarius was not the choice. It must have been a necessity. And the obvious factor may have been mineral depletion. Provided that it is correctly understood, we have scant direct data on the production of the Roman mines. But we know that progressive depletion forced the Romans to go deeper and deeper into the veins of precious metals in places like Spain and the Balkans, placing a terrible burden to extract. I'm going to use an interesting thing that I was told a few years ago. When the cost of extraction of minerals gets higher than the actual value of the minerals, there's no point extracting it anymore. And interesting enough, in 1984, there were mines in the valleys that were very productive. And some of the mine owners were told, this is true, if you get the mines to buy really expensive equipment, it will mean that the mines are now no longer making a profit. Because they paid out all their money on that new equipment, it means that we can close down the mines. And that's what a tool was used. They got some of the mines to actually buy expensive equipment in, meaning that they were working at a loss, meaning that the mines could be closed down. I know that this is a metaphor for what we're looking at here. It surely is, because without the value being taken out of the mine, there's no point having the mines in the first place. Vis-a-vis, that's what I've just said. We don't know exactly what broke the proverbial camel's back, is the plague or the mining, but the mines were abandoned, the pumps ceased to function, and the shafts become filled with water, meaning that you are unable to extract it to make a profit. Without a constant supply of precious metals, the Roman gold disappeared, used to buy luxury items from China, particularly when you talk about the West, but things in the East were slightly different. So it's not the same as running out. There were resources there, but it's how they're extracting them. So you see how the Roman system went down in a cascade of effects that was originated by the depletion of the precious metals, and of course, this terrible outbreak, the Antonine plague, is very similar to what it's saying here. It is what's happening to us today with our black gold petroleum. Depletion may well cause crude oil production to go through a Seneca collapse, not because we are running out of oil, but because it is getting more expensive to extract it, hence fracking and all that nonsense. So, you know, this devastating consequences on the modern empire we call globalization. That might sound like a political statement, and I apologize for that. So in sort of putting this all together at the end now, the Antonine plague is this a writer, McConnell, and the others cite the Antonine plague as a direct cause of the decline in lead production revealed in their data. This is most likely an oversimplification of a much more complex chain of events. Again, in any case, the highest lead production was attained by a people before the rise of a great Roman population. It's given different figures, and I've given 100 million. It's sort of saying the Roman Empire had 45 million people. There was more lead production. There was less lead production after the height of the people in the Roman world, and it's all different causes to do with the Antonine plague and so on and so on. But I think the point is, with all that being said, is that the limits to growth, when you get to the limits of growth, the sense of the Seneca collapse, no matter what has caused the collapse of the Roman world, the population starts declining. And it says here the population starts declining much later than the industrial system. The limits to growth, the Seneca collapse, different ways of looking at it, different ways of behavior, different ways of seeing the collapse of the Roman world. And then we start to, again, look at that chart. And one last thing I'd like to end on is this image. When we actually come back to the Romans in a few weeks' time, and we look specifically at the changes in Britain, which look at something known as the Great Conspiracy in 367, looking at bodies lying in the streets at Carlisle and Cirencester being unburied. All these different things we'll look at again, the silting up of the baths at Bath, and all these different things that we'll look at again, the collapse of Roman civilization in Britain. Byrd Oswald, when you go, if anyone ever says to you that the Roman military left Britain in 410, they are lying out of their back teeth. Because at Byrd Oswald, there was a Roman garrison still operational in 430, 20 years after apparently the Roman military left Britain. They've still got armor. They are slightly different in the way they're looking at things, what they're doing. They're bringing their families into the fort, but they are still a Roman military garrison, thinking like Rome, hoping that Rome will sort of reinstall the old Roman ways. But more about that one again. And as we start to get to the way end of this lecture today, this is the Roman fort at Byrd Oswald as it had been before the other image. And then that's Byrd Oswald today. Wonderful site for looking at very late Roman evidence. What we do see, they demolished the Roman barracks. And after they've demolished the Roman barracks, they build new buildings like this one. And then they build great grain silos, which the weather was really bad that day, wasn't it, Keith? Yes. But we did, and it was a weird sight. Suddenly the sun was out, it was brilliant, and then it rained and it got freezing cold. I don't think somebody wanted us there, but it was a wonderful place to actually go to see the sense of late Roman civilization. And we're back to this last image. So Jane, you haven't spoken much, so now the floor is with you. Would you like to say anything before we actually call it a day?
Only that it's been very interesting to make comparisons with then and now, but very depressing to think about the inevitability of it all, because we've never learned any lessons, have we?
I think, yeah, go on.
And looking at the general population and the way they're responding negatively to this, to sort of isolation and all the rest of it, it just makes me think that we're just going to continue doing the same thing all over again until we get to this point again in however many years.
I did actually give you a ray of hope. I did actually say about the Amazon civilizations. We will actually go on back there. And the ray of hope was actually the Eastern Roman world. So I mentioned about the Eastern Roman world.
We've got to learn a lesson from it, and I don't think we're going to.
Oh, now you're being negative. I'm trying to be positive, love. So what we're going to do, anyway, thanks for that, Jane. That was actually a good, nice close on that. So what we're going to do, we're going to open the mic. So we're going to unmute everybody. Everyone needs to unmute themselves. I think I've already done it. Sue's iPad. Right, what we're going to do, I'm going to do a quick rounds of, I don't have long statements, just say one thing, 1.5 things. So Pam, anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, the closing of the lead mines, could it have coincided, well it did, with people's immune systems, so making them low?
Yes,
and then
nobody
they
said that.
developed
Yes.
the plague.
Yes, yes. What we talk about is I failed to put this in there. I do apologise. Lead weakening people's immune systems, and you know, when we think about it, okay, there was a lot of lead piping. It became lined with lime, and the lead piping was okay then. But what we're talking about is more about the mining. Lots of the people who mined were actually trained Roman legionaries. And if you had somebody mining for too long, this is why they got civilians in. You couldn't mine in a lead mine for more than 5 years until dying. So obviously that tells you that the immune systems are low. Right, Andrea, quickly.
No, it's just really interesting. I enjoyed that.
Thank you. Rosamond, quick.
Yes, I've learned all about the Seneca Effect. I hadn't heard of it before. So yeah, great.
Thank you. Jim.
Collapse and growth.
Because a lot of people have died from lead. Yeah, a lot of people have died from lead poisoning.
Yeah, obviously, no, that's not a major effect. I think what it is, it's part of an effect of destroying the immune system. So the answer is yes, and the answer is also what I said to Pam. Sue?
Yeah, I'm very content with what we heard today. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Long live the Romans.
We've already done Jane. Keith?
Yeah, very interesting. I think it's always interesting on declines of empires, but I still think there must be some other factor that we're not aware of when you contrast the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. The Western recovered and went on, and the Eastern didn't.
Oh no, the other way around.
Sorry, the other way around. I still think there must be other factors involved.
Do you know what? I would like to do is I want you to all think about this over the next few weeks, and when we actually revisit this, it would be good. That is key. The Eastern Roman Empire is key. I'm glad you agree. Somebody agrees with the other. Right, Karen, quickly.
Yeah, no, nothing to add. That was very interesting.
Thank you, and Ellen.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. I can't remember. What was it?
Seneca.
Yeah, because that's what I was saying about natural resources and using them all up. And getting too big populations, but I agree with Jane as well. But also we're worse, we're more monstrous than any previous civilization at all, because not only are we more ravenous, we've created things that don't biodegrade, and we create monstrous amounts of pollution and toxicity, which previous eras haven't. But yeah, we never learn, do we? Never ever. No matter what. And we've got the best planet in the universe, and we still just treat it like shit.
Yeah, we're a cancer on the face of it, really.
We are a complete cancer, and do you know what? Just two things there about we do see that the toxicity levels at Roman lead sites are quite high, so we've got that as a comparison. The other thing as well is, as I said, with the amphora pile outside Rome, 100 meters high. I think somebody said it was 150, but I can't imagine that. But 100 meters high, so it's a huge pile. They didn't learn. They just didn't learn at all. Chris, quick.
I think COVID-19 is fighting back. It's the planet fighting back against us as a virus.
And do you know what thanks for that. What my grandmother used to say, my grandmother, whose name's Margaret, will not be mentioned. My grandmother Margaret, she used to say that the human population needs a good disease to reduce the human population, and she always used to say that, and I've always quoted that, and I've always regretted. I didn't really understand what she was saying. She wasn't saying about per se the human population. I think what she was trying to say is something has to change. We did actually, to be honest with you, we had a chance in the 1980s, the massive recycling movement. I was one of the first to fill the recycling bin with paper, right? I did that in the 80s, right? And suddenly people forgot about all that, and we didn't take another decade and a half to start to recycle things. And I tell you what, we've had so many lost opportunities, and how dare us presume that we can keep on this planet destroying it, as Ellen said. And Goff, you've got the last statement.
Well, here's what you just said, and very good lecture. I look forward to next time.
I look forward to seeing you all next week, and if anyone wants to chat afterwards, then they can. This would work really well today. I'll see anyone on Saturday, see anyone next week, give everyone a call. So I'm going to sign off to everybody. Thanks for that, Goff, Ellen, Jane, Rosamond, Andrea, Sue, Karen, Pam, Jim, Keith, Chris. Anyone wants to chat can do. If not, thank you very much. Bye. Cheers, guys.
Bye. Bye-bye, Daddy. Bye-bye,
Bye-bye, Sam.
Bye, Daddy.
Bye-bye, witches.
Night, John Boy.
Night, Jim Bob.
Yeah, Jim Bob.
Night, Sue Ellen. Go on.
And I was interested in the hazel and the willow fencing thing.
Oh, right. You're the only one here, so I'm going to stop that recording now, Sue.